This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Roger McEowen. He is our K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor that joins us every other week with an ag law update. And this week, we're going to be talking through the top 10 ag law developments for 2022. So, Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Samantha.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have you actually in studio. Makes things a bit more fun. Yeah. So we've got a lot to talk through, and we're going to work for the bottom up. So number 10 came in as the USDA's emergency relief program in the definition of farm income. So let's talk through that.
Yeah, this was a big deal for 2020 and 2021 when that program was developed. It's a virus-related piece of legislation, but you had to have a certain amount of farm income to be eligible to qualify for this. The problem that came up was with the definition of farm income and whether that included trades of equipment. You know, you could generate some income from trading tractors and combines and so forth. And since 2018, based on the 2017 tax law, we no longer route those through Schedule F, so it doesn't show up as farm income. It goes on a different form, Form 4797, where we eliminate self-employment tax. And the USDA's position was, over complaints from some of us that were encouraging them to change that definition, was that would not count in the definition of farm income because it wasn't showing up on Schedule F. So that's a big issue. You could have a farmer that would have a lot of trades in a particular tax year, and then they wouldn't have sufficient farm income to be eligible for this relief. And that's the issue.
Moving on to number 9, another USDA issue, a decision to not review wetland determination upheld.
Yeah, this involved a South Dakota farmer who ended up having 0.8 of an acre of a puddle in his farm field as a result of some conservation a tree belt that his grandfather planted in 1936. And as that developed over the years, the trees matured. Of course, it snows in South Dakota in the wintertime. That snow would melt and it would find a spot in the field where the water would collect. It has no drainage associated with it. And about half the time he couldn't farm it without draining that off himself. The other half of the time it would evaporate or soak into the soil, and so it wasn't a problem. USDA came in and certified that as a wetland, which meant that he couldn't farm it without losing his subsidies, and he pointed to the statute saying, I'm entitled to a recertification. I can appeal that, and you have to come out and look at it again. Well, USDA had developed a regulation that said, no, you can't do that unless you can show that circumstances have changed. That wasn't in the statute. That was in their reg, and so the case was over whether that was a reasonable interpretation of the statute. Farmer lost in the trial court, currently on appeal to the 8th Circuit.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out for sure. And another one that's still playing out, this next story, number 8, Dicamba drift damage litigation. Obviously, this is still an ongoing issue.
It's ongoing on the punitive side of things. The court basically upheld the compensatory damages, but they threw out the really large punitive damage amount. You know, we're in the millions and millions of dollars worth of damages on this. This involves Missouri's largest peach farming operation. And this litigation has been going on for some time. There are other cases. This was not part of the class action litigation. They went separately on this, but still a huge judgment that came in. It was separated between the compensatory damages as well as the punitive damages. We're on appeal now with respect to the punitive damage.
Absolutely. Number 7, the Misnamed Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, misnamed is a good way to put that. This really has nothing to do with reducing inflation. It's basically a green energy bill, kind of the light version of what some in the Congress were wanting. But it does have a few tax provisions in it that are important for us. It's got a lot of funding for ag programs. Basically, the Congress is throwing all kinds of money, billions and billions of dollars at various things, and a lot of it's ag. So there are a lot of ag conservation programs, different types of incentives that are out there for farmers under this legislation.
Just a bit of a misnomer there. And then number 6, case law on legislative developments concerning ag-gag provisions.
Yeah, I hate the term ag-gag, but that's how it's referred to in the media, so I'll stick with it just because that's what people are familiar with. These are these state laws that try to provide some level of protection to livestock confinement facilities from those that want to do them harm by lying, for example, on a job application so you can get access to the inside of a packing plant, for example, or a confined animal feeding facility, and then you can take clandestine videos and put them on social media out of context and then create all types of problems for these operations. And so states have come in and said, well, you can't do those things. And, of course, the challenge to these in the courts is, well, that's a restriction on free speech, and so it's unconstitutional. And we had a number of court cases in 2022 from Utah and Idaho and Kansas and Iowa, largely saying that these laws are unconstitutional, which creates a problem for the state legislatures in terms of, well, how do we protect these animal businesses, these livestock facilities, and at the same time do it without violating the Constitution. The Kansas case involved the Kansas statute, went to the 10th Circuit this past year, and was held unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Part of the Iowa statute was upheld as constitutional. Part of it was deemed to be unconstitutional. It'll be an issue that continues on in 2023.
I was about to say, a tale as old as time, that one, I feel like, and one that, like you said, we'll continue to see play out just as things change, the environment changes in terms of what's accepted and what's not. Moving on to number 5, a story that's been, again, just in the news a lot lately, the WOTUS final rule.
It seems like this issue has been around ever since I started doing these things 30 years ago. We've had a significant U.S. Supreme Court opinion on the definition of a water of the United States about 16 years ago. That didn't clear up the matter. We had the Obama administration come up with their own definition in terms of the administrative agencies. The Trump administration came up with the National Water Protection Rule, and now the current administration has changed back to where we were prior to 2015, and they brought in this significant nexus test, which the courts had trouble figuring that out. It led to a lot of lower court decisions on that, with courts being all over the board. And this is currently an issue that's also before the U.S. Supreme Court in the Sackett opinion that's coming to us from Idaho. And I'm somewhat disappointed that the agencies, meaning the Corps and the EPA, came out with their rule prior to the U.S. Supreme Court opinion. I wish they would have waited until the U.S. Supreme Court decides the Sackett case. Maybe we'll get a clear definition of what a WOTUS is. But now we've got this rule that's out there. It's going to go into effect middle of March, and there are already lawsuits against it, and we'll have to see if the U.S. Supreme Court's going to clear this up once and for all. I tend to think that this is probably, again, another one of these issues that's going to continue just to be there and antagonize a lot of farmers.
Yeah, a messy situation for sure. And our next one's a bit more broad of a subject, but number 4 is just economic issues we face this year.
Yeah, economic issues in general, very big in 2022. We see inflation that's been at the highest level in 40 years. We've got a money supply that's out of control, which is driving that inflation. We've got just crazy energy policy that's also contributing to inflation. We have wage inflation. We've got all kinds of problems. In terms of agriculture, the economics in ag right now on the beef sector, demand is pretty good. Pork, not quite as good. Poultry's got all kinds of problems with avian flu, and that's going to continue into 2023. We've seen this with price of eggs, just outrageous. I just had a call from an individual on the East Coast about 10 days ago as we record this, and they paid $8.99 for a dozen of eggs. It's just unheard of. So general economic issues, grain markets are going to be still in some turmoil because of the war that's being fought in Ukraine, what's happening to world grain markets. Prices are still pretty good for farmers. Land values are holding up, but interest rates are rising and have risen. And so the input loans that farmers are getting in early 2023, they're at a higher rate of interest than they were a year ago. So that's going to squeeze some farmers in that respect. Machinery prices are still high. And so we've got I think some turbulent waters as we come into 2023, and a number of things that we're going to have to watch with respect to the farm economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think economics is going to be on the mind of many as we continue into 2023, and I don't think that's going to subside anytime soon, unfortunately. As we come up the list even further, number 3, the Endangered Species Act regulations.
Yeah, there were a number of changes in 22 with respect to endangered species. The definition of what habitat is, eliminating some rule changes that were made in the Trump administration that private landowners thought were pretty good, because the problem with endangered species from a landowner's perspective is that we have a majority of these species that have a major part of their habitats on private property. So we're not just talking about the Endangered Species Act protecting species in national parks and other federal lands. No, a lot of their habitats on private property. And if you have a species, a protected species or an endangered species that's found on your property, then it really curtails your farming activities. And so that's a concern. And so we want very carefully thought out definitions of what habitat is, what take is, and all those rules. Many of those rules changed in 2022, not for the benefit of private landowners. And that's why I have it as number 3 on my list.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've done a lot of discussion over take and things like that because of the lesser prairie chicken, and its ruling now is threatened, and that's still pending. It's on a pause where that's not going to be put in place for a while now, but still something to be cognizant of.
That's right. Yep.
We're about to cut to a short break, but when we return, Roger will share with us the top 2 ag law stories of 2022. Two stories that we still have a lot to follow up on in this new year.